And even though I did do a few Zoom classes, starting with later in March and early April, once that pandemic set in. Hello, how are you? I'm going to repeat because some of the material I already gave, because I don't think that all of you were hooked up at that time. You'll let me know if it's a problem. In any case, it will sort of, set in, that we will now be getting this medieval era. So we had gotten mostly through that 10th century. Hello, Joel, you're listening into my class? To the 10th century. And we're going to be starting soon the 11th century. All right, no, excuse me. We did the 10th. We sort of did a lot in the 11th century, and now we're going to go into the 12th century. And I see a real division between those two centuries. It looks like Jewish life got a heck of a lot, worse in that 12th century. We'll discuss the reasons why, and certain cabals, certain accusations, these false accusations against the Jews, they all seem to come to the fore again in that 12th century. Not to say that everything in the 11th century was hunky-dory and smooth. I mean, there always, the Jews were isolated. There always were anti-Semitic, divisions, but it doesn't come to the fore to the extent that it will in that the very end of the 11th century and into the 12th century. Just to remind you, so we had done Spain. We had talked about Spain up to this time. Again, it's most of the Jews are living under a Muslim empire, and things are very good and peaceful. On occasion, there are some lashings out against the Jews, but they're very localized. They don't last that long. And mostly the Jews are living really very good lives under Muslim rule. There are some Jews living now in northern Spain, but primarily most of them are in southern Spain, where certainly, the Muslims are in very a strong control. But when we turn to France and Germany, where many Jews have now settled, and those communities are growing, things are very different and difficult. I think as I'm reading and preparing, for the class, and I think, oh my God, how did they live, under those conditions? I mean, obviously we know how horrible, of course, the Holocaust was. But we're talking about something that's going on decade after decade after decade, century after century, of living in these most deplorable conditions. So I'm going to start by giving like a survey comparing, what life was like for the Sephardim, I mean, specifically those in Spain, and what it was like for the Ashkenazim, which is the term used for those Jews of France and Germany. And eventually those Jews are going to move then to like Bohemia, Moravia, that's like what we know as Czechoslovakia. And then ultimately, not again until the 1500s, they'll go into Poland and Lithuania. And of course, there are Jews also living in Italy. Their lives are, sometimes troubled. Otherwise, they're living, again, fairly stable lives. And then don't forget, then the other large Jewish community is the one in North Africa. Okay, so come along with me on this journey. We're going to see, the difference between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim, and then we're also going to see this transition from that 11th century into the 12th century, and what sort of anti-Semitic attacks, will be on the rise. Okay, let's see, Muslim Spain. Okay, we know Islam in general, maybe not today, of course, but back then, was much more tolerant of the Jews and of Judaism than what was occurring in medieval Christian Europe. So our biggest problem, right? Those of us who are considered Ashkenazic Jews was the church. There's no question about it. There was only one church at that time. So we're talking about what will become to be known, of course, later in the 1500s, the Catholic Church. The head of the church is the Pope in Rome. And starting already in the 400s, they've been preaching against the Jews and that we're responsible for the murder of Jesus. It's like all the ills of society can, you point the finger at us, that we are the ones to blame. And that's why we become more and more isolated. One other just general thing I want to bring out, again, we'll be talking a little bit about it, but this is the age of feudalism. There are some very powerful nobles. These countries are not unified yet. I'm talking about the ones in Christian Europe. Depending on a particular monarch, perhaps some are more powerful than others, and they will, rule over larger territories. But very often, these countries are divided up under depending who a particular noble or duke, was, and actually this worked out somewhat to the Jews' advantage, because they ever had problems in one particular, let's say, principality, right, or dukedom, they would pick themselves up and move to another where conditions were more favorable. So it's not going to be until, as we go a little bit more into this medieval period, that the monarchs are going to grow in power and will consolidate their control over these countries. But now it's fragmented, all right? And the church is all powerful, and their priests, the monks, again, they're getting up in their churches and just spewing this, anti-Semitic accusations against the Jews, and vilifying us, and they're the reason actually for most, of the troubles that the Jews are going to suffer under. Okay, so now just a little bit back to Muslim Spain. Now the Jews might have been disparaged for rejecting Muhammad's teachings. Obviously, remember I told you we were considered second-class citizens. We're called dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I, dhimmis. And this would apply to, obviously, the Christians also. But they were never accused of killing Muhammad. So, I think that's the difference, why it became so ugly in Christian Europe, because here, they're deifying Jesus, and here we killed their God, and in the Muslim lands, this just did not occur. As long as the Jews were willing to play a low-key role in the assertion of their religion, they enjoyed a great deal of personal and religious freedom. And we once talked about that Pact of Omar, that their synagogues couldn't be too high. Obviously, the mosques had to be the largest and highest buildings. They couldn't always ride on horses, they had to ride on donkeys. I mean, there were all sorts of, rules and regulations, annoying ones, I would say, more than anything terrible. And the one thing to bear in mind, because we always associate this with Christian Europe, but the idea of wearing a yellow marking, in the case in the Muslim world, it was a hat. You had to wear a yellow hat. It took its roots there. Okay, it will only be later that the Christians will think, gee, what a brilliant idea to demarcate, to show. We look like the other people. It wasn't like we looked so very different. You have to wear some sort of yellow badge to differentiate you from the pure, Christians. All right. And again, even with this thing with the yellow hat, I don't know, whether how strictly this was enforced, but it was on the books, so to speak, as part of this Pact of Omar. Now, this again, here we're going to come to something different. Again, between these two communities, the Jews were never forced to publicly debate the truths of Judaism with Muslim clerics or Jewish apostates, which will be the case starting in that 12th century in Europe. I'm talking about Christian Europe. Nor were their books and manuscripts ever confiscated and destroyed by public governmental actions. And this is going to occur actually more into the 13th century. Even though forced conversions, destruction of Jewish property, and banishment were not unknown to the Jews of Muslim Spain, such acts were seen as aberrations caused by the occasional eruption of Muslim fundamentalism and political revolution. And I had mentioned earlier, they were localized. A particular town might have these things, but they were not of like very long duration. And those Jews, obviously those who could escape or were God forbid massacred, could go to a nearby town and live there peacefully. It wasn't widespread as it will become, right, in Christian Europe. Jewish genocide was never part of any public policy backed by the majority of Spain's Arabs. Muslim society was freer, more open, and more cosmopolitan than that of the Christian world. Now I'm going to bring up some other points, and I think they're really true to try to understand, like, why was it so different? Besides just the Muslim rule, there's something perhaps about living in a warmer climate that makes one, although ultimately the Inquisition was brought there, so it is not totally accurate, but at least in the earlier days, it was pleasanter to live in a milder climate. That's why we're living down here in Florida, right? Than it is when you're cold. And don't forget, those homes, those the huts, the cottages, whatever they lived in up north, they were freezing cold in the winter. They lived under very, very harsh conditions. That's why you know those magnificent tapestries you see that come out of the medieval period. They are obviously only the wealthy, the nobleman or the king, could afford them, but they were used then to line the walls to give added warmth to their homes. They hardly bathe. That's how perfume came into being, because they wouldn't bathe for the entire winter months. I mean, you could go 5 months without taking a bath. So they started using perfume so they would smell better. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit more about Spain, right? The climate was sunny and warm. Spain experienced no harsh or dark winters. And just like here, I mean, don't you find it so much nicer, the fact that, our earliest Shabbos down here, let's say, it's 10 after 5, whereas up north it's 10 after 4. And just in general, it's milder, it's more pleasant living in such a climate. In addition, the country's vegetation and produce was rich and varied, with the generous availability of citrus fruits and numerous vegetables. So I guess they had healthier diets living there. Don't forget, because the growing season would have been that much longer. Muslim control of trade with the East guaranteed the availability of spices and other condiments that in Christian Europe were rare and exotic. The rate of literacy among the general populace was also far higher than in the Christian world. There was more scholarship, general, I'm talking about secular scholarship going on, in Spain than you would have found in France or Germany during this middle medieval period. Muslim Spain had professional scholars, learning centers, and large libraries, and it encouraged the study of philosophy and the general sciences. Poetry, literature, song, and architectural innovation were highly treasured arts, and its practitioners were held in high esteem. It is also presumed that life expectancy was greater in Muslim Spain than in Christian France or Germany, where, get a load of this, you might have learned this years ago, where the life expectancy was only 35 years old. I mean, how unbelievable. You can now understand why people that got married at such a young age, they would be 12, 14 years old and they'd be married because they had to right away start having children, because they would, but by their time their children were older teenagers, they would have died already. Certainly the knowledge of medicine, anatomy, and pharmacology was much more advanced among the Arabs, where even dentistry was understood and practiced. It's just a much more advanced society, more open to different ideas. Maybe that's why that included being tolerant of their Jewish minority. They weren't afraid of them, and they weren't accusing them of doing anything terrible to their, well, they never said that Muhammad was a god. He was a prophet, another prophet. In the Arab domains of Spain, Jews were an integral part of the economy, unlike in Christian Europe, where they were only peripheral to it. We'll, as we go explore it a little further, I mean, the Jews were restricted from many occupations, living in France and Germany, whereas in Spain, there were no barriers, and they can go into any fields that they wanted. Spanish Jews were landowners, even of large estates. This goes all the way up to the expulsion. That's why some Jews opted to stay, because they were wealthy and they did own land with orchards and fields, and they did not want to give it up. So that's why they ended up becoming these secret Jews. They were also doctors, professors. They were landowners, right? As well as merchants, importers, bankers, and farmers. So you can see they lived a beautiful, rich life there. They were also doctors, professors, poets, administrators, and public officials. Though subservient to the Arab rulers of the country, they were not treated as the chattel of those rulers. Again, in a feudal society, that's what would happen, that the noble or the king, he owned his serfs. They were literally, they could not leave, that land. We'll find out there were some ways that they could, but by and large, they were tied to the land and owed certain amounts of the produce. They kept a small amount for their own personal selves, but the bulk of it had to go to the noblemen. A great deal of social and economic opportunity was open to the Jews. Only in northern Spain, where the Christian Reconquista had already begun in the 11th century, that means as the Christian rulers gradually began to take back the lands which had been under Muslim rule. Remember, we had said already in those early 700s, the Muslims came in and conquered, Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and plus Portugal. There are Jews living in Portugal at this time also. But as I say, gradually, as the Christians started to consolidate their power, this is before Ferdinand and Isabella, but even some of their ancestors, they are already starting to gradually recover some of their land and their property and their rule over that part of Spain. Again, that begins in that 11th century already, although it won't be as much of a problem until we get more into the 12th century. And as a result, you can see the differentiation now between Spanish Jewry and those of France and Germany. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit more about the Jews, right? The Ashkenazim. Ashkenazic Jewry lived in a dark, repressive, violent, superstitious, and fanatical society. As I'm saying, I wonder how they survived this. We're talking about centuries of living. Look, I guess I put down roots. They were somehow making a living, and we'll see. How actually the yeshiva proliferated then, and there was a lot of rabbinic scholarship, but I can't imagine what it was like for a regular Jew, living there. Jews were literally owned by the lords of the manor. Okay, remember I told you, the serfs, they're tied to the land. Well, Jews are not tied to the land. They weren't even, they couldn't, it was forbidden by the church for them to have, for example, even slaves, which certainly did exist in those days. And they had no means of running large tracts of land. Now, some Jews, obviously we learn about Rashi, right? And we're talking about, that 11th century. We learned that he was a vintner. He owned vineyards or processing things to make wine. But I don't think that they were living on the land. Even when we talk about Rashi, they lived in towns. They might have owned lands, I guess, if they had the means, but it weren't like as if they were living on as in Spain. They might have actually had beautiful homes and lived in estates themselves. Um, so again, what was the Jew status? They were considered, right, they were owned by the lords of the manors and were legally chattels, much as were the animals and the serfs. So it would be the nobleman's Jew, or it becomes eventually it was the monarch's Jews. Their economic role was initially severely limited, and they engaged chiefly in agriculture. But I'm saying I think they were living more in towns, where at that point there were more villages, handicraft, and small shopkeeping. In France, they were engaged in the wine industry, as we know, because of Rashi. And in Germany, they were prominent in the raising and dealing of cattle. I find that interesting because you know that the Jews who then eventually found their way to Poland and Lithuania, a lot of them were in that cattle industry. The church and the nobility also used the Jews as their middlemen in money lending activities. This is how we got into, that field, and were then accused later of usury. And they were portrayed by the church in a most negative light. General society tended to be ignorant, illiterate, and governed by rumors and superstitions. The people were just, they themselves couldn't even read on their own. I think, perhaps you've learned this. During the medieval period, the only way that any scholarship that even continued to exist was because of the monks, because they would copy down, prior documents of the Greeks and the Romans, and that's the only way that it survived, later on into the time period of the Renaissance. In this world of the fantastic, demons, fairies, witches, and devils all really seem to exist. With no understanding of sanitation, diet, or anatomy, medieval Christian medicine oftentimes was more deadly than the diseases it allegedly combated. Sometimes, if there was a Christian person who truly was curious about some of these fields, right? Of medicine, they would actually go to Muslim lands where they would gain the knowledge. They would even travel to the Middle East, to certain countries there, to gain this knowledge and then bring it back. But where they lived themselves, it did not exist. And there were also, I found this interesting, there was no accurate measure of time, no clocks. I remember once reading about this, when they started introducing clocks, into medieval Europe. No widespread use of calendars, no written records. They sort of just existed, I guess, day to day. Sun came up, you woke up. Sun went down, you went to sleep. Even though the paths were always clogged with travelers, wandering was common during the Middle Ages. Okay, think about Chaucer, right? And remember how he wrote about this conglomerate of people didn't seem to have anything to do with them, but that they were traveling together, right? With Canterbury Tales. Okay. They were wandering was common during the Middle Ages, but there were no maps and few roads. Travel was extremely dangerous. Journeys consisted of brief periods of security in the communities along the route, interspersed with hours and days of fear and danger in the forests. The majority of travelers had only the haziest notion of where their destination lay. The only way to travel was in groups. Again, think about the Canterbury Tales, and again, how, we know the various characters, that are in those tales, and why are they all, how do they come to be together? But there was security in being part of a group. Jews were a particular risk when forced to travel, but they did. To visit scholars, to attend yeshiva, right? Rashi, remember, he came from northern France, the Alsace-Lorraine region, but he goes to Mainz, Germany to study because that's where Rabbeinu Gershom was. So they did. He wasn't the only one. Other young men would have done that. And obviously to engage in commerce, right? They had business to take care of, so they had to travel, and to search for a better quality of life, to satisfy their innate curiosity about God's world. The term wandering Jew carried a great deal of truth, for Jews were much more mobile than the general society in which they lived. And again, I think that's in part because so many of them were involved in the occupation of trade and working as merchants, and eventually, because of being forced, into the role of usurers, of lending money, they'll eventually get into the very early beginnings of the banking industry and documents of credit, et cetera, et cetera. That's how they do. Again, because they're not farmers. They're not owning vast tracts of land. They have nobody who can work under them, and they themselves are owned, as I say, supposedly, or connected to a nobleman or a particular king. Okay, so all this is due because of feudal society. Just talk a little bit about that. Okay, the majority of Europe's population was impoverished and enslaved by the manorial or feudal system of life that governed the Middle Ages. And this all was a slow process. It starts, with the end of the Roman Empire, when there's this chaos and these Vandals are coming in, the Goths, and, society is just totally coming apart. So gradually, certain key people, again, this would have been the noblemen, would have risen to positions of prominence. They had the wealth, the means. I mean, this doesn't happen overnight. It takes place, over decades and then centuries till they consolidated their power. And then that whole idea of, the serfs, these people that were tied to the land and were, so to speak, owned, right, by the noblemen. And then eventually then the kings will come into play. But at this point, we're talking about a beginning of an age of monarchy where the kings will consolidate their power and gain control over larger and larger tracts of land, but the nobles are still pretty powerful. Just think, now again, this is early 13th century, but you think about the Magna Carta in England, that's 1215. And obviously the noblemen there were quite powerful because they forced the king to sign that document, to limit the powers, all right, or a sharing of the powers. Now, you remember I told you, so how could you escape being a serf? I mean, how could you possibly? Only the knight, who was dedicated to war. Okay, so you could become a knight, so to speak, a soldier. Again, you would always be tied to the nobleman and or the king, but they didn't have, you weren't, livelihood was not dependent on the land, and you would travel about. Obviously, you were in the employ of the nobleman and or the king, and you had to fight his battles, etc. But it was a way, and I think that's why it's probably certain younger men, obviously, and then maybe they did that for decades, or as long as they lived. And, but it was a way to escape the back-breaking labor, of running their lands. Or you could go into the clergy. All right, that was also another way to escape the life of a serf. Again, you would be subject then, of course, to churn and canonical law, but this way you could escape the control, especially for a clergyman, the control of the lord of the manor, to whom prior to this he owed allegiance. Now he's owing his allegiance to the church. As I told you, churches really becomes all powerful during this time period, until ultimately, we're talking about later on, the monarchs are going to knock heads again. Who's going to have ultimate power? Okay, and it will ultimately go more to the monarch than the church. But this earlier period, it's that the church is all powerful. Okay, as for the serf, he was bound to the land of the lord by legal, economic, and social chains. He could not leave the manor estate, and he was treated as a chattel, a near slave. Only with the emergence first of the medieval village and later of the town did the serfs slowly begin to escape these bonds. I remember I took a medieval history course, nothing about Jews, but a medieval history course when I was in college, and it's thanks to the growth of towns that whole feudal society and economy eventually will come to an end, and more people will gravitate to living in these towns. Obviously, the towns had to be on a parcel of land that at some point belonged to the nobleman or the monarch, but they had more independent lives, and they were earning their livelihood through some sort of artisanship, or they themselves ultimately will engage in trade. Early on, maybe it is the Jews are more dominant, in some of those fields, but it's going to be taken over then by the general population. Okay. Again, but it would be centuries before the despotic system of the manor finally collapsed. Okay. Now, the Jews, where do they sit? What's their status? They belong nowhere in this rigid class system, being at the same time a complete social outcast, again, because they were not Christian, as well as a vital economic tool. Thus, the treatment of Jews was spotty, inconsistent, erratic, and subject to violent swings of extremism. I guess this would have depended on the preachings, the monks or the priests, would have been dependent on the attitude of a particular nobleman and or king. Because of this uncertain existence, Jews could not make long-range plans or commitments, were extremely mobile, and attempted to maintain as low a public profile as possible. Even the few Jewish rich were cautioned in displaying their wealth. Actually, we're always told we should be careful, shouldn't flaunt it. And they were most conservative in their behavior. Still, the Jews remained the convenient scapegoat for the lord of the manor, the violent knight, the clergyman, and even the lowly serfs. You see, they could be, even these serfs, who were so tied, to the land and to their allegiance to the nobleman. But again, they'll go to church on Sundays or any of their holidays, and all they're going to hear is this anti-Jewish, rhetoric. It's going to rouse them up, and you'll see how this is going to impact the life of the Jews, as I say, starting at that very end of the 11th, going into the 12th century. Any disaster, miscalculation, or economic and social calamity could be blamed on the Jews. Jews had no standing in society, or like we were stateless, no legal protection or rights, and no desire to actively participate in European Christian society. I mean, we turned very, very inward, right? Obviously, anybody who was in the trade or merchants, they obviously had to deal with non-Jews. But I would say that would be basically it, and then go home and just, be within their own families, their own Jewish communities. The Jews tended to live together in the towns. So you can see now why Jews are gravitating to towns. Again, they're not owning land or small parcels, right? With the infrastructures of their synagogue, the mikveh, and schools. Thus, even before the implementation of the governmental policy of enforced ghettos, Jews chose to live in close proximity to one another. And those of us who live, I live, on near BRS, the Circle, that's almost completely actually Orthodox Jews who live there. Those of you, obviously, you're coming from Century Village. Look again how many Jews have congregated there, and now specifically so many Orthodox Jews. It's a comfort level to live among your own. My daughter lives in Marine Park, Brooklyn. Now there have been many Jews, Orthodox Jews have moved in, but it was primarily an area, it still is, I think, to this day, of Italians and Irishmen. They're also comfortable living near one another. Now, just some general little topics about fun and childhood. What was it like growing up, in these medieval societies and these medieval small towns? I guess that's a general statement. The Middle Ages was certainly not a fun time. And maybe it was for the very little children. Maybe first of all, then you're not so cognizant, of the outside world and what's happening. The entertainment of the time was limited mostly to traveling troubadours, right, or storytellers, and primitive play acting. The knights engaged in jousting. Jews restricted these types of entertainment to Purim, weddings, and other religious festive occasions. Apparently there's some discussions in some of the later Meforshim, they'll talk about troubadours, coming into towns, or that there was jousting, and let's say somebody was hurt, and then question of damages. It's very, very interesting. Uh, Childhood ended early, many times death. Look, I told you, if you're always, you know, most people did not live beyond the age of 35. And by the age of 10, almost all medieval children were part of the labor force. Didn't have any labor laws in those days. Though Jewish children received an education until the age of 10 or 12, it's interesting, it doesn't go up to bar mitzvah age. It apparently stopped even a little before them. And girls would have been taught at home. Um, Mostly homemaking skills. I don't know how many of them were actually, well, we know like Rashi's daughters. I mean, so obviously they were taught, they could read and write. But I guess as a general rule, perhaps Jews, Jewish girls, right, did not really receive an education. I always question this, though. Did they not receive some sort of a rudimentary education? I mean, we are supposed to daven or study the Torah, so it's a little unclear. Or maybe just, I guess life was so harsh and people had to just learn basic skills to survive. I mean, they didn't have the time. But I guess boys, this goes back all the way to BCE. We learn about Shimon ben Shetach. This is in the 1st century BCE, and setting up a system of public education in Israel, so that again, emphasis on boys, that they should receive an education and go to school at a certain age. So I guess that concept, that idea continued even here in medieval period. So as I said, until you were age of 10 or 12, again, these young boys would learn at least a basic education, learn to read, and write. And also, look, eventually, if they did go into business of some sort, they needed these skills to be able to communicate. Boys who showed promise in their studies, we're talking about Jewish studies, continued in the study of the Talmud. To further their education, they would travel to faraway scholars in yeshiva to later become the rabbinic scholars of the next generation. Hence something I told you, like Rashi, growing up in France, but obviously they could see, how extremely intelligent he was. And so he was sent actually to Mainz, Germany, to study at the great yeshiva there, where Rabbeinu Gershom was the Rav. The majority of Jewish boys, though, became workers, artisans, farmers, porters, and apprentice shopkeepers, most before mid-adolescence. So obviously, we learn primarily about these great rabbinic leaders, but we're talking about there were, thousands of other people, and they never achieved that level of godless. They had to earn a living. Since life was short, marriages were arranged early, I discussed this before, and childbirth began at a young age. Unfortunately, though, since mortality was a common occurrence, there were usually many orphans in Jewish society. Did you ever think about why we always had orphanages, in so many towns? I mean, my son Shalom is in London at the Bevis Marks Synagogue. And the shul obviously itself still exists from 1701, but it was a whole complex of buildings. And one of the buildings was an orphanage. And I remember when I was in Rochester, sorry, I forget the man's name, but he was telling me, I guess his father had died and his mother just couldn't seem to make ends meet. And he was sent to be raised in the Rochester Jewish orphanage. We're talking about now going back to medieval periods, but it existed for look, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. Poverty, disease, and random violence threatened everyone. As a result, the Jewish community undertook many social and familial responsibilities, which continued to a feeling of unity among all the members. And maybe that's why all these various, chesed organizations, they have a lot of their, I'm sure Jewish communities, wherever they were, throughout all the ages, were always there to, look, aren't we instructed throughout Chumash, I don't know how many times repeated over to take care of the widow and the orphan. So obviously these always existed, but I think perhaps maybe they became a little more organized now as there was a kahila, was established and certain, obviously the Rav would have been a key person, but there was the Gabbai, there was the Shamash. Now we think of them as being just doing things within the shul, but they also had prominent roles of helping the Jewish community. And so again, a lot of those self-help organizations were found their roots here. I remember, well, we're not there yet at all, but when we learn about the Jews living in Poland and Lithuania, they were highly organized by the time, the Jews established themselves in those lands. As I told you, they continued unity, and the Jews of medieval Christian Europe took care of their own and survived as best they could. Certainly no help, whatsoever from the Christian society. So, they took care of their own. Well, as we still continue to do as best as we can, although we definitely receive governmental help, certainly not here in the U.S. and in many other countries of the world now. Okay. Now we're going to go back a little bit just to talk about the growth of towns, because it was crucial to the role that the Jew is going to manifest now in this feudal society. And the growth of towns will gradually change the composition of these lands and where whereas beforehand all of economic society was based, it was agricultural, and now it's going to shift more to like the merchant class. The eventual this also, by the way, will be the reason why the nobleman's role will gradually decrease and the role of the monarch is going to rise in its stead. The eventual establishment of towns had a singular and positive effect on the Jewish population. It was the merchants who made the towns. By the way, and just so you know, where were these towns established? They were usually along a river, all right, because that's where the trade would go. I mean, you certainly could send things overland, and they did with horses and wagons, but it was a long schleppendicke trip. So if all along, like that River Rhine or the Rhone River, in France, so different towns would spread. It was so much easier to move merchandise, on a river. You could put a lot more onto a boat, to traverse, and then some of these rivers, depending where they were, would lead into, seas, and that's how they ended up doing international trade. The merchants bought the privilege of self-government, substituting a money economy for one based on land. Gradually, a middle class arose, right? Rich and energetic and contemptuous of the feudal world that surrounded them. Gradually, Jews too flocked to the towns to live where there existed a modicum of freedom and a place deemed safer than the countryside. Again, in the countryside, there can be these marauding knights, who could so easily, attack you. And in the town, there was a certain measure of security. Some of them were walled, not all necessarily, depending, on a particular locale. But, there's, I guess, a feeling of confidence living in close proximity to other, people who were similar to you. Towns provided the environment that allowed Jewish life and scholarship to grow and develop. But towns often had strong physical and spiritual drawbacks. Now we're going to describe what it was like to live in one of these towns. The stench of refuse, dung, sewage, animals, and sweaty human bodies packed together gave rise to miasma of stench in medieval cities. I'm sure there might be medieval towns or parts of cities in Europe, but I think where it hit me the most, I was in Svat, and that which certainly dates back hundreds and, it would have existed even longer than that. But if you pay attention, if you're in the old city of Svat, so I noticed that the street had sort of like a center. They're made of stones, and there's an area like a rivulet, a lower thing like in the middle, and then a little higher up, and that's where people would walk, and they would literally throw their garbage. They didn't have toilets, and it would just go there, and I guess maybe eventually it rained, or maybe, I don't know, somehow flushed it down, whatever, pretty nauseating. So should you be back in Svat one day, look at how the streets are fashioned there, again, in the old town, obviously. The smells of town could be detected from miles away. All garbage and waste matter was thrown into an open sewer, the way I just described, that ran down the middle of the street. And animals roamed the streets at will. You know the custom that supposedly the man is supposed to go on the outside and the woman should be on the inside when you're walking, down the sidewalk. That dates back to this time period, so that say a wagon or a horse would go by and splatter up some of this filth, onto the little higher part of the street. But this way the woman would be protected. Her shoes and clothes shouldn't get dirty. This led to the spread of disease and infection. We're not talking till actually into the 14th century, but like when the bubonic plague, began. But believe you me, they must have had cholera, dysentery. They had other terrible diseases, that did exist and affected, maybe not the whole continent, but certain parts, certain towns, certain areas. And death, unfortunately, occurred at an early age. Jewish streets were somewhat cleaner and tidier than the rest of the city, but sickness took its toll everywhere. Obviously, I don't know how good their water sources were. That's why eventually the Jews are going to be accused. The wheat poisoned the wells. Great. Every time, again, this is such a superstitious society. They don't understand or know anything. The Jew is a very, easy scapegoat. They've already been preached to, for decades, for centuries, about how terrible the Jews are, and they killed their guys. So they're to blame for everything. Homes in the Middle Ages were mainly one-room structures. The virtue of privacy was virtually unknown. In Jewish homes, the latrine was usually in a separate area. But it was not until the age of the Renaissance, we're talking about more in the 1500s, that the ideas of personal space and greater cleanliness became more widespread. The Jews were on the cutting edge of fomenting such progressive virtues throughout the later medieval era. So obviously, they were a little more savvy. I think they understood better, perhaps, how disease would spread. So obviously they, apparently were among the forefront of those encouraging, that certain, standards of cleanliness, had to be put into effect. At the same time, the towns were the catalyst for change and progress. The Jews within the towns were frequently at the forefront of the expansion and growth of these towns. The towns also foster the ancient ideas of fairs, and I'm sure perhaps you watch TV shows and talk about going to these fairs held outside the towns. They were usually held in the fall and late spring, which encouraged trade merchants to congregate and deal. These fairs are the beginnings of a monetary economy, which replaced a barter one. Because before that, you would exchange goods, but now money is going to become, playing an active role. They also helped expand the spread of knowledge and skills across artificial political borders. People would come, they would be from another country perhaps, or even another section of a country, and bring in some new ideas and ways of doing things. The town fairs helped break the hold of the lords on their vassals. More freedom now to mingle with other people, undermining the manorial, self-contained and self-sufficient feudal society. Because up until then, in feudal times, everything was produced, grown, manufactured right on the nobleman's lands. You didn't, but now things are changing, right? Towns are growing, these fairs, and now you're able to import, I mean, they exported a certain amount of things, but they were definitely importing a certain amount of goods, and you're importing ideas now. The town fairs helped break the hold of the lords, all right? New ideas began to take hold, such as the interdependent system of international trade, monetary payment, credit, and mercantilism. We're almost finished. The early Middle Ages had suffered from a chronic lack of coinage and circulation, inhibiting trade and commerce. Jews were prominent in developing the economic vehicles of credit and other forms of payments, all necessary for modern mercantile trade. Remember when we learned about the Jews in Babylonia and then that Silk Route? Remember already then they were getting those skills, right? And had those letters of credit. So it's, the Jews have already had, going back, now we're talking about, centuries gaining these skills in business. Jews were also prominent in the field of money lending and introduced the idea of interest payment to facilitate the growth of trade. And of course, later on, we'll discuss a little further detail. I mean, they were sort of like forced into that business. Because of their international connections with Jewish merchants in other parts of the world, the Jews were in the forefront of helping to expand international trade. Jews were soon referred to as money people or sharp dealers. And eventually the word Jew, you look it up in the dictionary, you Jew someone, to became associated with ruthless and even questionable business dealings. This soon gave rise to the growth and spread of anti-Semitism throughout the medieval world, as if they needed something else to choose, but just an added fire to the fuel. So, and fuel to the fire. So I'm going to stop now. I hope you enjoyed the class and have learned something of interest of what it was like growing up, in this, medieval world, how hard it was, how very harsh the conditions were. But as I say, and we'll see with them be focusing obviously on these great Rishonim who are going to be coming out of this time period. I mean, to me, it's amazing because they lived pretty terrible lives, but they managed to keep on going. I mean, right? That's our strength, right? Why we continue to exist. And I'm sure studying Torah lifted their spirits and took their minds away from perhaps whatever terrible conditions might have been around them. But when you focus on Torah, I don't know about yourself, but I know personally, everyone, we all have sorrows, things on our minds, things bothering us. But when I sit and study Torah, really we're like transported to another world and it gives you peace. So, I can't say we didn't do Torah learning today, but we did study Jewish history. So I hope you too have enjoyed it. And I wish you all the very best. I really should stay healthy, please God, and, be in good health. Hashem should bless you. And may we, Halavai, first of all, let's resolve who our president is, and just move on from there. Should be good things coming in the future. So be well. I love all of you. Take care. And Amir Sashem, I will. I'll see you next week, same time, 11 o'clock. Okay.
Thank you.
My great pleasure. So nice to see you all. Just stay well, all of you. All right.
Thank you very much. Be well. Thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure.
Thanks very much, Malka.
Be well. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn it off now. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good one.
Yeah. Thank you also.